Well, good morning. Thank you so much for coming and participating in our second of 4 volunteer training opportunities this summer. For those of you who may not know me, my name is Marlene Schmidt. I'm the Paradise Motor Rover Coordinator. Just a couple reminders as we're here inside the building for training this morning. If you happen to have a cell phone, like myself, please go ahead and turn that off so hopefully we're not ringing while we're doing the presentations. And we are all adults here, so please take care of your needs in whatever way you need. So if you need to use a restroom, feel free to get up, walk out, and go use those. They are open inside the JVC building as well as across the sidewalk in the Slate building. And in terms of water, you are more than welcome to water. Please stay hydrated, especially since we are in this heat wave at the moment. It's extremely important for us to not get sick from that. So today our training is related to Native Americans, and what we're going to do is kind of present from a time frame of Indians and the United States, and then we're going to switch over and talk about the Native Americans here at Mount Rainier National Park, and then we're going to end with archaeology and some of the information of I'm trying to think how to describe it, just what some of our archaeologists do here at the park. And then we'll end with a short clip of Ohanapakash and some actual digs that they were doing to collect information about some of our historical use, traditional use here at the park. What I'd like to do is start off with Indians of the United States of America. This is going to be a timeline. And our presenter this morning is volunteer in parks, Cassandra Noble. I'd like to tell you a little bit about our presenter today. So Cassandra is a retired administrative law judge. She has a Bachelor of Arts in Anthropology with a focus on North American Indians with honors in cross-cultural dispute resolution. She has her Juris Doctorate, and she's a member of Washington and Montana State Bar Associations. She was the Assistant Attorney General for the state of Montana. And while she was working with him, you'll see that she negotiated and drafted a first-in-the-nation state and tribal agreement, as well as the implementing legislation and administrative rules between the state of Montana and the Fort Peck Confederation of Indian Tribes. And here in the state of Washington, she also presided over extensive litigation concerning oil trains in the Columbia River Gorge. Hearings involved in-depth testimony by Indian experts about Indian traditions, history, and resource protection. She wrote the associated decision section for the recommendation to the governor of Washington State. So I would say she's very highly qualified to give us a background of the timeline of Native Americans and the United States. So Cassandra, thank you so much.
Well, with that, I have to say that I don't consider myself an expert, and there are very few people that really are experts on all that's involved in North American Indians and the history of same with the United States. So I don't want to present myself as an expert, but I do have some background and some understanding that I've acquired over the years in the work that was just described that I have done. And I developed some kind of understanding, and I want you to have that understanding too, of some of the important events, the timeline of events, so that you can have a view of the political and social history of Indians in the United States. And I think I have to say, first of all, address the term Indians. When I was working on the negotiations in Montana, I was uncertain about what would be considered by them to be a polite way of referring to the different Indian groups, and they all told me, we're Indians, call us Indians. So that's what I do. I want to give you a sense of the consequences of some of the things that have happened, some of the laws and decisions of the United States. And in some ways, this is a difficult history to hear about. I don't want it to be negative, but in some ways it really is. And so things have been very cyclical, and we'll see different attitudes toward the Indians in the very beginning of the country, when the tribal people were much more numerous and much stronger, and some were very warlike and considered to be a threat against the United States. And then over time, as they were weakened, and the United States' actions toward the Indians were more forceful and difficult for the tribes. And another thing I want to say at the beginning is that not all Indian groups are alike, for sure. I absolutely got that pounded into my head when I was doing the negotiation, because different Indian tribes, even within the same general location, are different. They have different cultural foundations, and many of them are in groups that are consisting of several different historical groups that may have even been historical enemies with one another. And so many of the reservations are conglomerations of different tribes. And then also it's responsive to the geography of the tribal people who, after all, were here for thousands of years and responded to the places where they lived and where they gathered resources and where they celebrated. Plains Indians had really different cultures from Indians of the East, much more settled, and then the tribes that frequented and lived in the Pacific Northwest had still another kind of culture, as did the southwestern Indian Pueblos. So they're all very different. They all consider themselves different today and wish to be thought of as such, and are very proud of their tribal heritage. So I want you to just keep those things in mind. So we'll start with, in 1789, the Northwest Ordinance was ratified, and the authority from that comes from the United States Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, which articulates the United States government's treaty-making powers. There are other parts of the United States Constitution that give the government other kinds of authorities. It's more specific treaty-making power and some other parts of the Constitution, but that is the one that's considered to support the Northwest Ordinance that was created. And in the different cases that you read, the judges will look at different parts of the United States Constitution and history and find authority for doing all the various things that the courts have done over the years. The Northwest Ordinance guarantees tribal land rights. It created the first organized territory of the United States Indians in the region south of the Great Lakes, north and west of the Ohio River and east of the Mississippi. The ordinance directed that the utmost good faith shall always be observed toward Indians. Their land and property shall never be taken from them without their consent. That was 1789. The ordinance also provided, though, a method for admitting new states to the Union, and then spelled out a plan that would allow the United States boundaries to proceed onto the Pacific Ocean. So you can imagine the effect that that had, and it resulted in taking a lot of homelands from the Indians that supposedly were to have their property never taken without their consent. So in short, federal recognition of American Indian tribes pursuant to the Commerce Clause derives from the relationship between tribes and the U.S. as separate sovereigns. So the next period is the era that starts at 1790. That's called the trade and industrial area. And in that time, an act was passed, 1790, that established that no sales to Indian lands are to be made between any persons or states unless authorized by the United States government. You can see in that the United States government is assuming that it has the power and authority to decide on these things. And it has taken on itself plenary authority over the Indian sales of Indian lands, and the Indian tribes themselves are not preeminent in this already. So the decisions ultimately made about the transfer of lands in this pursuit to move the United States to the Pacific Ocean are being made mostly by the United States. There's the Federal Non-Intercourse Act of 1790 is called the Trade and Industrial Act, and it established that the United States government, I see my notes, granted management of the trade and diplomatic relations involving the Indians and their lands. So the United States granted itself that authority. There were disputes over the land and the law, and they would arise and were decided in the United States Supreme Court. And the court recognized that Indians were just occupants of the land. And this is a really important concept because this gave rise to something called the Discovery Doctrine. And the Discovery Doctrine was that the Indians were only occupants of the land and not owners. And then any discoverer of the land, a discoverer, acquired an exclusive right to extinguish Indian title, either by purchase or conquest. Now, it's good to say here right now that tribal views of land are extremely different from Western views of land. Every law student takes property law first year in law school, and property law teaches that land ownership is really a bundle of rights, and those rights include enjoyment and exclusion of others, and the right to pass it on and or dispose of it. And those concepts are really very foreign to the tribal ideas of what land means. And so the idea that people could buy land from the Indians was extremely difficult for Indian people to understand, and certainly the right of exclusion that comes along with fee ownership of land was something that was not understood in this period and for a long time afterward. There were, in the early 1800s, get the next slide, yeah, it was the westward expansion and Indian relocation period. In 1819, Congress pays missionaries, which are considered to be people of good character, to go and civilize American Indians and to eliminate Indian military resistance and suppress their traditional practices. So religious denominations, certain religious denominations were assigned to certain tribal groups, and they were encouraged to convert and adopt the Western styles of dress and housing and farming and so on. So right after this time, in 1819, we have, between 1823 and 1832, we have a set of 3 cases in the United States Supreme Court that are famous and determinative of the law that takes place from then on. And it's called the Marshall Trilogy. All Indian law practitioners know about those 3 cases and still cite them. The 3 cases, in brief, say this: that Indians do not own land and articulate in that case. The first one articulates that discovery doctrine. Now, I should say that the discovery doctrine is kind of interesting right now because it is actually something that just came up when the Pope was in Canada, and the idea is actually a Christian idea that conquerors can come and conquer land, and then they have rights to it, and that's okay. And so that was that first case was an expression of that discovery doctrine, and it distinguishes once again that tribal people have rights to their land, quote rights, but that doesn't mean that they have any of those bundle of rights that are we consider in fee ownership, and the land can be conquered and taken over. Yes.
Are water rights part of number 3?
Well, part of number 3.
The natural rights, is that?
Yeah. Well, the tribal rights were considered to be kind of use rights, and so it depends, of course, on where we're talking about. Let's say I tried to focus on this general area, and so water rights is such a complicated subject in the law, and in the West we have completely different kind of water right than you have in the East. In the East, water rights are those people who are adjacent to water, living on the stream or the pond, have rights to use that water. But in the West, it's much different. It's appropriated, and so somebody might own water rights to a piece of land that you own, and you don't have a right to that water. So this is a concept completely foreign to tribal culture.
Would they have the notion of like a watershed? I mean,
Well,
Mount Rainier has a whole bunch of watersheds.
that's right. Yeah, and when we talk about the tribes that were parties to the treaties, tribes around here that were using Mount Rainier, some historians will view their use of those rights as along the watersheds, and other experts say no, that's not really how they ever looked at it, that there was a certain, they didn't have this ownership slice, that the tribes overlapped, in individuals' uses of the water. And they didn't do agriculture really so much then, so we didn't have water used as much for agriculture as we do now. It was mostly water, drinking water, water for cooking, and so on. At that time, the tribes used a lot of native flora and fauna for foodstuffs. Something that they have lost because of other uses of land that have had an impact.
For some reason, the last week water seems important.
Oh yeah.
And it's also easy when you're talking to someone on the trail to point out, okay, where's the water going? Who has it or what? How does
It
that-
is. It comes into play for these particular tribes that I've been focusing on in fishing. The big rivers that originate up here. And particularly, for my focus would be the Nisqually River and the Puyallup River to a lesser extent. But we'll talk in a little bit about the fishing on the Nisqually, yeah. And I should mention that I have this couple of wonderful books here with me, and we don't have slides of some of the pictures, but I am going to put them out for you to take a look at after this, so you can see some of the pictures, and a lot of them have to do with Indian fishing, what kind of practices, and you can see how non-impactful they probably were on the resource, because they have much, they were taking far, far less than some of the commercial fishers did later.
Sorry.
No, that's okay.
If the quality of the water degraded such that impacted the salmon, Does that come into play then?
Well, it does now.
Yeah, yeah, okay.
I mean, I'll talk about Indian fishing in a little bit, but I will say that we listen to a lot of testimony about the concerns that the tribes have, the salmon tribes have about the quality of our rivers. And they have taken the step of putting resources and money into educating their own tribal members. They have some fine experts now that are native people who have a lot of authority in the field of water quality because they know what they're talking about. And they're doing a lot of on-the-ground work to protect the rivers, Columbia, Nisqually, Puyallup, those rivers. And salmon is one of the most sacred things to the tribes. They have a little complex of things that they regarded as having been given to them. And you don't waste, and you use them and in ceremonies and keeping your family fed and everybody's well-being. And it's a big part of Indian religious or cultural practices. And salmon is one of those sacred things, along with something else that would be on the mountain like cedar. So, so the main goal of this Non-Intervention Act of 1790 was to keep the peace and avoid war and keep the frontier quiet. There were disputes in the law that continued to arise, and they were decided on the basis of that discovery doctrine. In other words, sometimes, well, you lose, you're just living there. So let's go on to the early 1800s. And in 1846, the boundary was established between our state of Washington and Canada. And that you would be, it really had an impact on the tribal people that were living up in that area, because the line was just drawn, and it would split the use areas for the tribes or for families, and sometimes it just split a particular familial group, and they could do nothing about it, so they were made homeless by that. And some of the western settlers just came in and took over any structures and all that were built and in place on some of the tribal settlement areas. So it had quite a huge impact on tribal people in the area, both sides, on Canada and the US, and it made many tribal people homeless. And then we have measles. Well, let me just finish. I didn't quite finish with what I wanted to say about the Marshall trilogy of cases. The second one established that Indians are not subject to state laws, and that's very important and still being litigated today, but it's still true. And the third one is that Indian nations are distinct and independent political communities retaining natural rights.
Can I ask what are natural rights?
Yeah, that's a good question, and that's still being litigated also.
Okay.
Yeah, because there's this like doublespeak that you see in the cases and in articles and all that, where they are not allowed to own the land, and the land is being overrun by settlers and miners and other users of the land. So they're wondering what exactly is meant by natural rights, and that, as I say, that's still being litigated. Although the tribes are having an awful lot more success these days in litigation. They also have educated a lot of tribal lawyers.
I had a quick question.
Sure.
Sorry, I know you're trying to get the point.
No,
through,
I love questions.
I'm conflicted in Indians don't own land, but then what is the discovery doctrine? Is that more about someone coming upon piece of land, maybe a settler saying that I've discovered this piece
Mhm.
and therefore I have claim to it. Is
Mhm.
that the logic?
Exactly.
So
So
aren't they,
so when they have these, that's what I say, it's a little bit doublespeak, so they have the right, they have these natural rights, they're there, and they have rights to be there and use it, but then someone can come along and basically use this discovery doctrine and say, oh, now I actually own it.
right, so this is the
I-
government basically saying neither the Indians or the settlers own the land, it's the government that has the right to decide, is that what this
Well,
was?
the people that
This was
come
the
along and
premise.
discover, or by conquest or settlement, actually ended up owning the land, not
Right.
the United States government.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Later on, I have some figures about the amount of land that was lost in this way. So, disease. There, in 1847, that's just, I mean, of course, the wagon trains came over the Oregon Trail over a period of time, but just to put one date on it, the wagon trains bring measles out across the Oregon Trail, and that affects the tribes up here. And a serious malaria outbreak that was only one of the several diseases that come to local Indian populations, and but the malaria one was a little bit different because that is thought it had an odd origination, and it's thought to have come from sailors that came in and had some trade with Indian peoples living out on the coast, and they were giving them gifts, and it's thought that it's possible that the malaria came to the Indians through that method. But other diseases are thought to have come across a lot from the settlers coming across on the Oregon Trail, bringing diseases that were foreign to Indian people. They had no immunities. So, in 1831, the second Marshall Trilogy case, and then in 1832 is the third. I should mention here also that over in the east, in about 1838, well, over a series of years, a few years, there was something that you may have heard about called the Trail of Tears, and that was in Oklahoma, and a number of people were forced off of their lands onto reservations, and during that, the movement of these people onto lands that were considered to be wastelands at the time caused the death of about 4,000 tribal people, it's thought. So where are we?
That's 1851.
In 1847, some wagon trains came over the Oregon Trail and went to Walla Walla here in Washington. And the minister in Walla Walla was Marcus Whitman. You may have heard of Marcus Whitman. And the tribes over there were the Cayuse people, and they were affected very greatly by a measles outbreak, which many of them blamed on Marcus Whitman. And so some Indians murdered Marcus Whitman, and that caused a great deal of difficulty for the Cayuse. But they had a measles outbreak that was so serious that half of the Cayuse living in that area died from measles. There was another series of deadly epidemics in about 1848, and that included just not only measles but whooping cough and influenza, and that's just swept. Those just diseases just swept across North America and off to the Pacific. And then Native people have no immunity at all to any of these diseases, and were severely affected. It wasn't until, and I don't know why this was, but it wasn't until 14 years later that a Catholic missionary, priests came and vaccinated the Indians, so that helped a lot, but already they had lost, by that time, that was 14 years later, they had lost large amounts of the population. 1849, the BIA moves to the Department of the Interior, and the Department of the Interior manages public lands, as you all know, and national parks. And previously, the tribes were viewed as military powers, but by that time, they were so decimated by disease and by different warfare over land that they were considered to be much less of a threat, so they didn't need to be in that department dealing with Indians did not have to be in the War Department, so it's moved to the Department of the Interior. But that event meant that this created the removal of tribes from vast areas of public lands. In 1851, Congress created reservations, and then that in order to manage Native people, and it passed the Indian Appropriations Act, which established the reservations. The United States government forced Indian people to move to and live on the reservations where it could better manage and subdue them. That was the official purpose. And as a result, they were severely restricted in the obtaining their traditional foodstuffs and resources. And one of the effects of that is that they did not have a healthy diet and were in addition to the problems with the epidemics, they were less healthy and were weakened by eating foods that were not their traditional foods. The foods previously eaten by tribes were vegetation gathered from the wild, and also a lot of fish, and they hunted, and so there were no fish that really truly were bad for the health of Indian peoples, and they also conducted a lot of they were more active in gathering that kind of, so that also had an effect on their health. Roads and railroads moved across into the United States, and the United States helped that process by paying for surveys, and that alone, that encouraged easier access so that people could come and stake their claims to land that previously had been considered to be Indian territory, Indian country. In 1868, President Grant pursued this dispossession property and forced the movement of Indians onto reservations. And then the Christian ministers, missionaries were employed to teach Native people to farm and read and write and wear Euro-American clothing, and then particularly abandon their native religions. So that brought the treaty era. Indians were resisting moving onto reservations, and so it was thought that maybe some treaties could be negotiated with the tribes and help in that process to give the idea that this was a voluntary move. And so in the mid-1800s, the U.S. wanted to ensure that land was available for settlement for non-Indians, and American treaties were formed between sovereign nations, and they were still considered a sovereign nation. And in the U.S., their sovereignty was a source of federal law. So these were decided on the federal level, and then local officials set about negotiating these treaties. So in the Washington territory, we have, and you can look at this later, here's Governor Stevens, who negotiated several treaties in the state of Washington. And he was not to be denied. He was only 38 years old, but that was his mission in life. And he went around to the different tribes and had his crew to negotiate with the different tribal groups. The two that are really most significant for us here are these two treaties, the Treaty of Medicine Creek and the treaty with the Yakima. But I want to read you this little paragraph out of this book. Get me a better light here. This is when Stevens was negotiating the Medicine Creek Treaty. He said, and many people came. They dressed up in traditional garb, and came from all over, and it was considered to be a big deal. But when you kind of look into it, here's a description. Oh, and this book is written by a very distinguished scholar of Indian law and water law, and he took an interest in particularly the difficulties that took place with the Nisqually about fishing. And so he is writing about the history of these treaties that Governor Stevens negotiated. And he said the Indian people who spoke Salish knew virtually no English. Stevens had an interpreter who was fluent in Salish, but the governor insisted that these discussions of transcendent matters be conducted in the 500 words of the Chinook jargon. Like Pidgin English, the Chinook jargon was a rudimentary device for trade, a patchwork of English, French, and various tribal languages. And this author says, how could it possibly speak to sovereignty, land ownership, fishing rights, assimilation, freedom, or the future of societies? Ask yourself that question. I would think, just based upon my readings, that the people who signed off on these treaties, and I have copies of them here if anybody wants to look at them. They're actually quite short, and it seems to me that many of the people who were signatories to these treaties were not able to read them, and they didn't write English. They signed off with their mark, like an X. So a treaty is a kind of contract, and contracts are not enforceable if they're not a meeting of the minds, it's called. And so it certainly doesn't seem as though there was any meeting of the minds when one side doesn't even understand the words of the contract. Yes?
Was this the same
There are
Stevens
places
associated
that
with
loom large in the human spirit,
Dan Trump and Sioux
commanding
City
our
in that
attention
story?
and drawing us
I
closer.
think so.
Mount Rainier,
But I have copies of the treaties
so
if you want to
filled
look
with
at
its
them.
streams,
Most of the provisions of the
vast,
treaties
so
are
dominant.
quite favorable to non-Indians, but there is one paragraph that I'll read to you that is extremely important and has been important ever since, and is still, it's not really being actively litigated, but it comes up, and it is being followed now by both sides, certainly in Washington. There was a series of cases I'll talk a little bit about that settled with regard to fishing rights. But that treaty provision says, "The right of taking fish at all usual and accustomed grounds and stations is further secured to said Indians in common with the citizens of the territory, and of erecting temporary houses for the purpose of curing, together with the privilege of hunting, gathering roots and berries, and pasturing their horses on open and unclaimed lands." That phrase, open and unclaimed lands, of course, litigated a lot and has been pretty much resolved. So, in contract law, if you have one party that's extremely disadvantaged, and then a judge is looking at interpreting the contract later as to what it means, you always would look at the less advantaged party and interpret a contract, if there are two ways to interpret it, in the way that's understood by the less able party to understand it. And that's what has happened in a lot of cases involving these treaties. So court decisions since then have involved off-reservation hunting rights and fishing rights, and on open and unclaimed land. That particular phrase comes up in a lot of cases and has been defined and implemented. And it has been decided that these are rights that stay with the Indians, and the state is precluded from enforcing state regulations except where it's necessary for conservation purposes, and that's sometimes litigated as well, what's conservation purposes. And so courts have ruled that where treaty language is ambiguous, the rules are applied to account for the fact that the tribes were disadvantaged at the time of signing the treaties and their understanding of non-Indian legal concepts in existence at the time. And then I got something else to read to you. This is a book that was written by a very distinguished Indian lawyer who has litigated many, many cases, and he talks about the use of sacred sites. That provision is also read to mean that tribal nations have the right to use their land as they did at the time before Western intrusion into their territories. And that includes sacred sites. And there's a law that's passed to protect sacred sites. But this is a paragraph that explains what sacred sites meant to tribes culturally. Sacred sites are the particularly important in Indian religion. Indeed, as one expert has stated, no religion is embedded in place to the extent that tribal religions are. Indian religion is inextricably tied to the land, and courts have said this, that rituals must be performed in prescribed locations to protect humankind from discord and catastrophe. Failure to conduct these ceremonies in a manner and place specified, adherents believe, will result in great harm to the earth and to the people whose welfare depends on it. Holy places are central to the existence of Indians as people. And those are the words of federal courts. And so that is how the federal government is to regard sacred places.
Quick question, sorry.
Yeah.
Would the Indians view the top or the upper reaches of Mount Rainier as a sacred place? Would that fit that definition?
Well, I'm about to mention Mount Rainier. I don't know that specifically because when I studied anthropology, I focused on the Southwest Indians, and I did study some Northwest Indians. But one of the things that I have found in my discussions with tribal people and just over the years is that tribal people are not all that anxious to talk about where their sacred sites are. And sometimes, in some laws, they're allowed to do things to protect their sacred sites and not really disclose it when there's construction or something like that. So it's a complicated way, kind of a dance that we have to perform both sides to try to make sure they are truly protected, and not made public where they are and all that. But I think that paragraph really, and that paragraph has quotes from federal court cases that explain just how important it is and how much the land is important to an Indian cultural sense of what we would call religion. All right, so they are found that the courts have found that treaty rights are not rights that were granted to the tribes by the United States. They're inherent sovereign rights already possessed by the tribal sovereign entity and reserved by the tribes for exercise as they have been for all time. So you see the difference there. The United States didn't give treaty rights to people. They reserved them. They gave away certain rights in these treaties, but reserved for themselves these other ones. And they are exercised and they're litigated about. So tribal rights, such as those reserved by the treaties that concern the land surrounding Mount Rainier National Park, they reside in the tribes as entities. And one thing about this is that these rights are exercised, not specifically owned by tribal members, that they are treaty rights and must be exercised in accordance with tribal regulations. So it is the tribe that has reserved these rights. So federal and state courts have ruled that public land other than, for instance, there was a case in Olympic National Park where it was found not to be open and unclaimed land because its purpose, one of the purposes of the park was to preserve the animals living there, and so it couldn't be considered to be open and unclaimed because hunting is not allowed on the Olympic National Park, and so that tribal people could not exercise hunting rights in the Olympic National Park. And so, but in general, although parks are not considered open and unclaimed in most contexts, hunting rights are allowed on federal national forests. The tribes associated with the treaties that surround Mount Rainier are the Muckleshoot Indian tribe, the Nisqually Indian tribe, the Puyallup tribe of Indians, the Squaxin Island tribe, and the Cowlitz Indian tribe. The Cowlitz were not signatories to the treaty, but they are associated with the land around Mount Rainier and are very active in they're federally recognized now, and so basically are treated in a similar way. The Nisqually, Puyallup, Squaxin Island, and Muckleshoot signed the Treaty of Medicine Creek on December 26, 1854, and also the Yakima Confederated Tribes and Bands signed the treaty with the Yakimas on June 9, 1855 at Camp Stevens in Walla Walla Valley. 1870, we have a slide for that. All right. So that speaks for itself, 1869. Let me just say, in 1870, traditional foods of the western tribes are destroyed by settlement, and further land is lost to tribes as settlers and miners and ranchers moved onto Indian territories. This was a deliberate eradication, and then there was the deliberate eradication of the buffalo and commercialization of fisheries, and that included fishing offshore so that the fish coming up the streams were fewer. And then the commitment to vast areas of arid land to ranching resulted in hunger and famine for tribes. And in addition, overgrazing by livestock destroyed plants that tribes traditionally used to feed and heal their people. And the tribes on the Pacific coast were prevented from gathering shellfish by white private ownership of land. Canneries commercialized crops that natives harvested without regard for maintaining the wild stocks. This resulted in significant declines in the traditional resources. In 1871, Congress ends the federal government's practice of making treaties with Indian nations and fails to ratify nearly half of the treaties that the U.S. had already signed. And then we have the General Mining Act signed by President Grant, and I have some familiarity with this because I worked with also mine reclamation program in Montana, and this is really true, that filing for a patent under that law costs $250, and you don't have to get a patent to mine. You just have to pay claim fees, and claim fees are $5 an acre for a load claim and $2.50 for a placid claim, and it's still the same. So there's no requirement of notifying Indian peoples to be informed of mining claims on their land. And so these became successful takings of Indian lands without consequences. All over the West, there are things called glory holes, big holes that were dug for mining claims, and these impacted the local environment. And in some of the mines, there was no requirement of reclamation, and so whole sides of mountains could be denuded and ruined, of course, for gathering of tribal resources and hunting and so on. So now we're up to 1883, where the federal government established courts of Indian offenses to prosecute Indians who participate in traditional ceremonies such as the sun dance. This is a religious celebration, and people were prosecuted for it. The goal was to replace ancient spiritual practices with Christianity. Political, cultural, and spiritual leaders were imprisoned under these proceedings. Now we come to 1887 to 1943, which is considered the allotment and assimilation era. I think we're getting close on time. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So that Congress enacts the General Allotment Act, and this act divided reservations into individual allotments of 160, 80, and 40-acre parcels in fee simple ownership. This is called the Dawes Severalty Act, and I will tell you that that is one of the worst things that ever happened to the tribes in this country, in the opinion of many, including myself. And that is because there wasn't this idea of fee simple ownership, and so people all of a sudden had a different kind of relationship with the land, often didn't understand it, and often would sell it to non-Indians. Not only that, if tribal people didn't buy these parcels of land, they were considered to be surplus, and they were sold to anybody, mostly to non-Indians. And that resulted in something called checkerboarding of the reservations, and that meant that there were these parcels of land within the boundaries of the Indian reservations that were not Indian owned and controlled. That was a big issue with regard to that that agreement with the Fort Peck tribes, because that is a checkerboarded reservation. And so that was an agreement for the state and the tribes to work together to regulate underground storage tanks. Between 1887 and 1934, more than 86 million acres, more than 60% of the remaining tribal land passed into non-native ownership. And as a result, the lands being sold or leased for development, housing, farms, Indians lost access to traditional hunting, fishing, and gathering sites. And wild foods that were important to their diets simply became extinct or inaccessible, and this forced Indian families to rely on government rations, unhealthy food for them. Let me say something about population of Indians. In 1890, in the United States, census records indicate that a native population of 237,196 people in the United States. This represents a decrease of approximately 95% of the population that is believed to have existed in the year 1491, before Columbus. That was 100 million. I will say that 2020 data indicates the population is now up to 9.7 million. In 1899, we all know that President William McKinley established Mount Rainier National Park and created from a national forest, and here we are. The intent was to preserve natural and cultural resources, values, and dynamic processes, just as tribal people had always done. And at the time of the creation, the tribal people around Mount Rainier were using Mount Rainier, as you mentioned, all of the people. And there seemed to have been a kind of more cooperative relationship between the tribes and not a sort of ownership of watersheds. 1917 is World War I, and the tribal people are not yet citizens, but they enlisted in World War I in large numbers. And American Indian soldiers were often granted dangerous scouting assignments, and the tribal people were willing to do that and eager, even from what people have said about it. And this is thought, scholars have thought that this is attributable to warrior traditions in certain tribes and strength and discipline in American Indian cultures. And then in 1921, Congress passes the Snyder Act, which provides for Indian health care. Now you see these big acts being enacted to reform the relationship between the United States and Indians and to provide for services as best as possible, and not always very well. In 1924, American Indians are granted citizenship in the Indian Citizenship Act. However, not all Indians were eligible to vote in certain states yet. This is 1924. In 1934, there was a commissioner, and this you probably know, is this still correct? John Collier, Commissioner of Indian Affairs. Well, anyway, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs issued a circular on American Indians, and he questioned the way that Indian religious freedom was being allowed and the authority for local and regional bans on traditional ceremonies. So there's a turn there in public policy and a suggestion that maybe the government should not be doing that. But that's 1934. And in 1934 also, President Franklin Roosevelt signed a law known as the Indian Reorganization Act, IRA, but that act encouraged the establishment of tribal governments that would be like those in the U.S. and constitutions similar to those in the United States. That move was criticized by Indian leaders because it was thought that tribal people did not have the same kind of cultural history and understanding of governing themselves in the same way the United States did. So the idea was, well, we'll just make them all into little Americas, but that didn't quite work. So some of the leaders in the tribes viewed the IRA as another means of imposing white institutions on tribes. Instead, they urged establishing native tribal government structures that derived from ancient forms of tribal organization and government. And then we have World War II, 350,000 American Indians enlisted, and then you have heard, I'm sure, and read about the use of native languages and to keep telephones and radio messages secret. And then also there was a special office of communications, and the Indian languages were used to send messages back and forth, and these are the same languages that the federal government had attempted to eradicate in reservations years before. And then in 1945, we have, I didn't mention the highest rate of enlistment by North American Indians. And then in 1945 to 1960, we have the era of termination and relocation. And there was the Office of Indian Affairs is upgraded to the Bureau of Indian Affairs within the Department of the Interior and given more authority and resources. And in 1953, Congress passed a resolution establishing a federal policy of termination pursuant to the authority under the Commerce Clause. And termination meant that American Indian tribes would be abolished and disbanded. So during this period of time, there was this effort to move Indians off reservations and move them into urban sites. And then there were some other significant things that happened. One of them is the dam building that happened in 1957, which affected tribal fishing rights on the big rivers. And one of the most significant ones for this area was the dam that the Columbia River, the Dalles Dam that was built, and that destroyed the fishing of the Indians, the Celilo people, the village on the village of Celilo, and the way that the fishing was done on that area was no longer able to take place because of the dam building. And so this forced Yakima and Warm Springs, Umatilla Reservation fishing families to relocate away from the newly submerged river banks used by Indian people for traditional fishing for millennia, affecting an ancient way of life. They have adjusted, I will say, they have adjusted to that, and they have an elaborate system of fishing rights along the river, and those are very controlled so that the resource is not depleted, and we heard lots of testimony about that. In 1959, Washington State, this is where the pictures in that book are interesting. This is where Billy Frank was so active in fighting back against the incursions into the reserved rights to fish on the Nisqually River. And that was a bloody and a very horrible time. There's a very moving picture in there of a young man whose head is down, and there is an officer behind him. The young man has just been tear gassed for fishing, and people were arrested and people were killed fighting over rights that supposedly were reserved rights in the treaties. And there are pictures in that book that I leave for you if you want to look at it. That gave rise to a decision by, well, first I'll say that Washington State challenged tribal fishing rights and tried to forcibly eject Puyallup, Nisqually, and other tribal subsistence fishermen from fishing on sites reserved in the 1855 Treaty of Point No Point None Treaty. And that included the right of taking fish from the usual and customary grounds and stations, and the right to erect temporary houses for the purpose of curing. And as a result of the state's exclusion, the traditional food considered sacred to the people became unavailable of salmon. And the loss of salmon in Indian diets once again eroded Indian dietary change and impacted sacred cultural practices related to salmon, which are still considered one of the key sacred resources central to the cultural life of the affected tribes. So, there are three federal cases related to these Washington tribal fishing wars called the Bolt decision. Washington residents seem mostly to know about the Bolt decisions. They're called the Bolt decisions because they were decided by Judge Bolt. That wasn't the name of the cases, but Judge Bolt listened carefully to the testimony about what I just said about the importance of the salmon to the people and their reserved treaty rights, and came up with a decision that was considered to be in favor of the Indians' cause. Non-Indians, a lot of upset, and there were demonstrations, and there was a lot of difficulty involved. But basically, the Bolt decision decided that the tribes' reserved rights had never been abrogated, and so they had the right to have 50% of the catch of the fish in the rivers that they had fishing rights over. And that was a compromise, because the reserved right actually said that they had the right to take whatever they needed. So theoretically, they could have taken 100%. But this Judge Bolt decision still caused a lot of anger on the part of commercial fishermen and sport fishermen, but it has held, and the tribes still exercise their fishing rights today, and that seems to have calmed down. I don't know what the present opinions are about that, but that's the Bolt decisions. And in 1970, in 1968, President Johnson signs into law the Indian Civil Rights Act, and replacement of the termination policy by Indian self-determination, which is now the new era, the self-determination era. And things flow from that. And then in 1970, President Nixon denounced the policy of terminating Indian nations and announces a new policy that the Indian future is assimilation. The Indian future is to be determined by the Indians, and Indian policy forced assimilation was abandoned. So this was a speech. It just was announcing a federal policy, but it wasn't associated with any particular legislation. But in 1975, the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act was passed, and empowers tribes to exercise their sovereignty and to control their own affairs. Now government agencies must contract with Indian nations and provide services for their own people. Healthcare, education, housing projects, and so on. In the 70s, Congress had been investigating allegations of Indian religious practices that were being disrupted. And so there were reports about Indians being prevented from visiting their sacred sites, denied the use of religious practices, and kept from performing services in a traditional manner. So then we have the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, which was a joint resolution, and it legalized the exercise of traditional spirituality and ceremonies, and it overturned local and state regulations banning spiritual practices. However, it lacked a penalty provision. So that was a problem. In 1981, the Supreme Court issued the first of several decisions clarifying the scope of tribal civil authority and jurisdiction in Montana versus the United States, and decided that the inherent powers of tribes generally do not extend to the activities of non-Indians living on fee lands. Now, that's the Dawes Act. All of the people living and owning lands that are within the boundaries of a reservation still could not be governed by tribal law. And in 1988, we have the Indian Gaming Act, and we all know how that has benefited the tribes. In 1990, we have the Native American Languages Act, and I think that Marlene knows something about that.
So for those of you who don't know, I taught up in Alaska for 12 years. And the particular school district that I worked in for 10 years has really done an amazing job of bringing back the Yupik language and teaching it in the school. When I originally started working in the Lower Kuskokwim School District, we had a handful of schools that were bilingual for the younger students, and then they would switch over and learn in English, but would have one class each semester that was Yupik. After 12 years of being there, following this law, the school district had 19 of the 26 schools were bilingual from preschool all the way up to grade 5. And then for junior high and high school students, they were required to take a Yupik culture class, and that included Yupik language. And now they're actually increasing that even further, and the required bilingual education is kindergarten through 7th grade. So they are just expanding their program, and half of the day is taught in Yupik, and the other half of the day is taught in English. And the teachers really work together in terms of which class is going to be in which language each day. So it's really, this particular act really has an amazing effect in terms of saving language and getting at some of the deep culture for Native tribes.
Wouldn't you say too that some of the things that are expressed in native languages are almost impossible to express in English?
Definitely.
And then in 1990, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act was passed and provided that universities and museums receiving federal funds must return American Indian human remains to and sacred objects to the tribes that ask for them. And then in 1991, Tribal Self-Government Project Act. It provided additional time and in connection with an earlier law, but that it was all aimed at controlling, allowing the tribes to get able to control their own decision-making and management programs and services that were previously controlled by the BIA. And in 1993, Interior Secretary Babbitt requires consultation, an important word now, with projects, consultations with tribal governments for proposals that affect Indian trust property. I should mention that the land on Indian reservation is usually trust property, held in trust by the United States for the benefit of the tribes. And that is the real complication for the people that are trying to bring some of those checkerboarded lands back within the reservation. It's very long and involved process to bring the land back into part of the reservation because of the fact that of trust property. So it's just not as easy as you might think to be able to just reacquire those ceded lands. And then in 1995, the Department of Justice issued a policy affirming government-to-government relations with the tribes. And in 1999, the Supreme Court affirmed off-reservation tribal hunting reserve rights of a Nooksack Indian tribal member here in Washington, and holds that the state-owned Oak Creek Wildlife Area is open and unclaimed land, as set forth in the Treaty of Point Elliott. And in 2004, the Supreme Court affirmed Congress's authority over Indian affairs, ruling that Congress can expand and contract the scope of Indian inherent authority. And if it's inherent, I don't know how that could be. But anyway, in accordance with the United States Constitution, Indian Commerce and Treaty Clauses, which grant Congress plenary and exclusive powers to legislate in respect to Indian tribes. That's U.S. versus Lara. And I will mention to you a couple of recent cases from couple of our new justices, and apparently they're fighting with each other. There's a case called McGurk versus Oklahoma, which had a rather shocking holding by Justice Gorsuch, that about half of the Oklahoma is actually Indian country in eastern Oklahoma. It caused a big stir, and Justice Brett Kavanaugh, when he came onto the court, was very negative about that. And there's a very recent decision, I think it came out in June, Oklahoma versus Castro Huerta, which had some language that tribes are a little concerned about, because it gave states concurrent jurisdiction to prosecute crimes in Indian country. So it's still going on. And I'll mention too that a few things in closing, and that is that there is a story by a respected journalist that a young woman who benefited from one of Justice Scalia's written opinions involving Indian property rights. She later met him at a book signing, and she spoke with him and introduced herself to him. And she says, this reporter reported, that Justice Scalia said, well, when it comes to Indian law, we're all just making it up. I have no reason to dispute that, but boy, it certainly, in looking over the cases over the years and in just reviewing things for this, it just seems like sometimes that's what they're doing. And I want to finally say that in my interactions with the tribes, with their attorneys, and in the very, very long and involved process of this negotiation that I did, I was always treated with the most amazing good humor. I mean, literally humor. There was this just wonderful sense of kind of wry humor that I so appreciated. And even if all these things had happened to tribes on behalf of non-Indians, and all the back and forth, and you see now there's a little bit more back and forth happening, there was a determination to be self-governing and to decide for themselves how their life would go and to continue on with their culture and traditions. It's just, to me, personally, it seemed heroic. So, any questions? I'm leaving the books there for you to take a look at. The pictures, I think they're very moving, particularly about the Indian wars. And I should mention that there's a picture in there of Billy Frank being arrested, and also a picture of what was to become the Billy Frank Wildlife Refuge down there at the end of the Nisqually River in the Delta. So, does anybody have any questions? It's a lot to go through, I know. Okay, thank you.